Okay, so let me now introduce Ricardo Salvador to you. I got to know Ricardo the first time, what, about 6 years ago, maybe? And quickly, I had already heard about him. He has quite an amazing reputation in the community of researchers and practitioners, especially people trying to push for more coherent policy to shift our food system to one that's more sustainable, both environmentally and for people. But as soon as I met Ricardo, I knew we were going to hit it off, and we've become, I think, colleagues who have mutual respect for each other, and I have very high respect for Ricardo. Ricardo is presently a senior scientist and director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is how I first got to know him because I serve on the board of that organization. Prior to joining UCS, Ricardo was a program officer at the Kellogg Foundation, where he was involved in really important development of funding programs to support the kinds of goals that he'll be talking to you about today. And prior to that, he was an associate professor of agronomy at Iowa State University, where he had some really important firsts. He was involved in teaching, actually he did teach the very first course in sustainable agriculture at a land-grant university. His graduate students conducted some of the early original academic research on community-supported agriculture before it was really a widespread phenomenon. And he and his students established Iowa State University's student-operated organic farm. I think that was established in about the year 2000, is that right? And he served as the first chair of the nation's first national sustainable agriculture graduate program. Finally, among his many accolades, Ricardo was named the 2013 NBC Latino Innovator, and he received the James Beard Foundation Leadership Award in 2014. So let's welcome Ricardo and enjoy what he has to share with us.
Well, thanks to Anne for the invitation and to all of you who are responsible for the event. And also thank you for coming. I myself would have gone to see Salman Rushdie. I'm bummed that I'm having to miss that as well, but it's very good for all of you to be here. And the topic is going to be shifting the food system in the direction of greater sustainability in such a way that it also shifts to greater health, to greater equity, and to greater sovereignty. And some of these terms may seem like they don't actually belong together. And I'll argue that you really can't touch any one of those without affecting all the others. Specifically, what I'd like to argue is that there are things being done in our name for the sake of the food system that most of us would not condone if we were fully aware, and that's why the system needs shifting. So let me first talk about what I consider to be the easy topic here, and that is that any time that you talk about shifting the agricultural and food system, one of the first questions to move out of the way is the apprehension that if you shift to anything that is different from what is placed right now, it automatically means that productivity and therefore the security of the food supply are under threat. So Anne mentioned that I'm an agronomist, and so from the standpoint of an agronomist, I'm going to talk about probably the most boring stuff, which is productivity at the top of this conversation. Then things hopefully will get a little bit more interesting. So what I want to say about productivity is that we obviously we'll always need to learn more and need to be humble about our state of knowledge at any given time, but productivity in crop plants we have a really good grasp of, so that it's not going to be a mystery to ascertain what is going to happen when we shift certain practices. What is more difficult for us to think about is consequences over a long period of time, because agronomists just have not accustomed themselves to think that way. But what I'd like to do is to share with you a little bit about what we know, and so I'm going with the paradigm or the archetype of productivity, and we're going to talk about how an agronomist defines or constructs yield. This is the jargon that we use. So all of you have a very strong biology background, I am sure, and you will remember your photosynthetic equation. You know that in essence what plants do, because several billion years ago, there was an adaptation in blue-green bacteria that enabled them to capture sunlight, and plants just a few million years ago actually appropriated bacteria into their cells in the form of organelles that we now call chloroplasts, so that they also can capture sunlight and convert physical energy into chemical energy. And all the rest of us are possible specifically because of that capture of that microorganism into a eukaryotic organism. So we'll skip millions of years of evolution and just talk about this archetype of modern productivity, which is the maize plant, second probably only to a sugarcane plant in terms of its potential productivity. As you know, what we get out of it is grain. And almost half of the nation's agricultural land is devoted to the production of this crop and a close rotational partner, the soybean crop. So yield, this is the way that we construct it. And so the first limitant is, of course, that since what you're doing is converting radiant energy into chemical energy, then the total amount of radiant energy sets the ultimate threshold in terms of what the potential is for you to convert that into yield. This is a very interesting process. The photosynthetic process is built down, or is broken down into several steps. Very few people actually would have any reason to know this, but you know that Einstein was the recipient of a Nobel Prize, and most people mistakenly believe that that was for his work in relativity, which was too controversial for him to be awarded that prize in 1915 for that work. But everyone knew already that he was a great physicist. The thing is what to give him a Nobel Prize for. So he received his Nobel Prize for researching the photoelectric effect, which is, in essence, electron transfer. In the case of photosynthesis, electron transfer happens across membranes of the chloroplast. And we don't need to get into the details of that. I only point out that in terms of the agronomy of the situation, we actually can count down to the level of electron excitations that a given wavelength of light where a mole photons can actually generate and calculate total dry matter that eventually we can convert utilizing that pulse of sunlight. So the models that do this then further take into account that not all of the radiant energy that is intercepted by the surface of the planet is going to land on photosynthetic tissue, and not all of that photosynthetic tissue is crop tissue. So then you have to take into account how much you're intercepting by crops, and in this particular case, by this particular crop. So the total photosynthetic flux cut down by the amount of it that you actually intercept, cut down by the efficiency of converting that light energy into dry matter. Now, but we know each one of those steps really, really well and can model these steps really, really well. And the efficiency is such that, I'll just skip to the punchline here, about 30% of the total that's captured has to be paid back to thermodynamics in the form of respiration and other maintenance that needs to occur to establish this system that you see there that enables the process to occur to begin with. And then finally, not everything that gets converted into dry matter is actually harvested or has traditionally been considered to be useful. So the very last partition, it's actually referred to as the partition coefficient, is how much of that dry matter is actually deposited in harvestable organs. So in the case of this plant, it would traditionally be the grain. And if it's the grain, then it's 25% of the aerial dry matter that gets packed off into that particular compartment. If it's silage, however, it is 50% of the total dry matter, 100% of the aerial dry matter. So you can just imagine this thing converted to lots of different crops and what portion of the crop is actually being used. Now, here's the reason to subject you to all of that pain from the standpoint of an agronomist, and it is to say that this is one of the dumbest ways that we could actually collect that radiant energy. And what this expression describes is a way of calculating the quenching of light from the top of the canopy to the bottom of the canopy. So from what I've just described, if your interest is in maximizing productivity, you want to make sure that not one photon reaches the ground, which is not photosynthetic. You want every photon to have been intercepted by some chloroplast in the successive layers of leaves in this very tall canopy of the corn crop. And so one of the things that this equation tells us, this is the equation for the light extinction coefficient, L being the last term over there on your right, is that as the light begins to penetrate, so these are waves of photons, as they begin to penetrate the canopy, they will be intercepted by some tissue which is not photosynthetic. So midribs of leaves, for instance, or the cell walls, they're not photosynthetic. But as it moves down through there, it will be filtered out. And this equation is Beer's law, which is basically how anything diffuses through a porous material. And so in this case, just imagine the porous material is the leaf canopy and what's moving through our photons. So a very interesting thing that comes out of this equation is that if you got a homogeneous canopy, then the rate of extinction of light as you go down the canopy is a constant. That's what that coefficient K tells us. Now, this is a very inefficient way of utilizing this light because the further down you go, the more you're washing out the light, the redder it is shifting, and therefore the poorer use the corn plant is making of it. Corn plant is sort of like a hot rod. It'll go very fast, it is very efficient at its photosynthesis, and it takes a lot of light to make it do that. So the deeper you get into this canopy, then the less light there is in the canopy to work with, and therefore it becomes more inefficient the deeper that you go down. So you're not making the best use of light. Now, I mention all of this again because this is the archetype of great productivity. And if we're worried about great productivity, this is really not the best way to optimize productivity if that is what we are interested in. Think about the fact that as you move down the canopy and the quality of light shifts, there really ought to be totally different species with completely different photosynthetic adaptations situated at different levels in the canopy to take advantage of the diminishing light, the redder spectrum, the deeper you get into the canopy. Now, before we get into some examples of how that actually is done, I'd like to show you that we go to all of this effort, and in fact what we're producing is not food. So if the worry about shifting the food system away from these large intensive monocrops of corn is that, well, if you do anything to touch that, then what about our food supply? Where's that going to come from? So probably the majority of you in this crowd are aware of the fact that the majority of the corn that is produced is not human food. The amount of corn that needs to be produced to supply you with sweet corn during the summer, or even the canned sweet corn, is infinitesimally small compared to what we actually produce every year. So this is what actually it goes for. So if you go from the bottom to the top, the uses are feed for finishing livestock, and then we utilize alcohol, or we distill the grains in order to ferment and then create alcohol. And that actually now is the greatest use. So this is the graph current as of this month. So that biofuel is now the greatest use. And what you would consider food, seed, and industrial uses, and food being the smallest part of that. So where it says there, seed, also very, very small. Industrial uses is to use the starch, for instance, and to use some of the oils that come from the germ of the corn and so on. So there's all kinds of excess production capacity here in an inefficient crop, at least grown in a system that's inefficient in terms of utilizing light. It tells us that if we really care about producing food, this has nothing to do with that. All of that light that is going into producing all of this stuff could be used to produce actual food, but this is not it. So whenever you hear conversations around huge concerns about the reliability of the food supply and the necessity of preserving the agronomic system that's in place right now, remember more than half of all cropped acres in the United States right now are devoted to this kind of a system. This is not about the food supply. This could go away and all of us could continue to eat in exactly the same way. Your price of hamburger would go up, but you could continue to eat in exactly the same way as you do. Now, let's talk about what would be better than this, since I've mentioned this as a critique, and therefore the implication is that something could be better. What you see here is an image of a native prairie in the Midwest. Here's a contrast that I want you to visualize. So, over a relatively short period of time in the Midwest, namely about 14,000 years since the very last glaciation, the combination of plant growth, first forests for about the first 4,000 years, and then deep-rooted prairie grasses as the area became warmer and drier, began to create very deep soils that today, for our purposes, from a human standpoint, we call very fertile soils, very productive soils. The process was that perennial plants would break down every winter under the harsh conditions of the winter, and then that material would decompose the following spring. Bacteria, fungi would work on them, and it would increase the carbon content of the soil, and the depth of the soil would increase, so that over a period of about 10,000 years, one of the areas of the planet with the most fertile soils developed. Now, it's not the only place where that happened, and that's something that Americans need to be really well aware of. There's other places like this on the planet as well, but this is one place where that happened. So if you think about what this process enabled, which was the agricultural development of this nation, that soil is capital to the United States. Wealth, natural wealth, exactly in the same sense that fossil fuel or oil is the wealth upon which the economy of the Middle Eastern countries was built up. And just like that fossil fuel, that has been extracted and diminished in exactly the same way because, now this is the thing to remark, 14,000 years, nature developed this very fertile soil. In 150 years of cultivation, the depth of that soil was reduced by 50%, and its native fertility and its organic matter was reduced by that same amount as well. Now, that loss is masked by the fact that in the modern system, we don't treat this as a self-contained system, but we rather import fertility by mining it from other parts of the world and concentrating it here. That's what the modern agricultural game is. Specifically, the modern agricultural game is to stage the game in a particularly benign or adequate place like this, but to feed it external inputs and therefore secure the supply lines for all of those external inputs. It's water, it's nutrients, it's energy, and so on. Well, but here's a system that does that for itself. The prairie system does that for itself. It builds up its own fertility. It builds up the quality of the soil. Here's a nice technological challenge. So therefore, do we know enough about biology and the ecology of the system to say, can we just live with that? Is there a way that we can secure a food supply from a system that has the wonderful property that it actually builds up its own resources, builds up its own capital? Or if even you want to say, well, but we're extracting from it the moment that we begin to eat from it. It's a matter of expanding the boundaries of the system that we're considering. So if we're extracting from it to feed ourselves, is there a way that in that grander system we can return capital to the system to continue to perpetuate its stability and its resilience? So keep that in mind as the model. So in the Midwest, the system that I just critiqued was put in by raising exactly everything that I've just described, but can the two be combined? Well, let me show you some examples, first of all, that you might consider to be exotic, but are real good examples of what I've just described. Example of the principle that when you combine crops that are made up of different architectures, so that the deeper you go into a canopy, you have different capacity to intercept the different spectrum of light that is arriving at that level in the canopy, you are becoming more efficient. And if each of those has a purpose, it doesn't have to be food, but if food is produced, or if green manure, material that you can reincorporate into the soil to build up the natural capital, is there, or if the crop does both things, or if you have a nitrogen fixer that essentially, under natural temperature and pressure, sequesters carbon from the atmosphere and injects this into the soil, then you've got a system that is way more efficient potentially than the system that I've just described. So here's the system that features the corn plant that we just saw, but you see that in this case it is not alone and not planted as densely. So this actually allows space for other crops, and this is very early on. This is about halfway through the development of the corn crop, for the purposes of actually seeing the other crop species that are growing in here. And I'll show you two of them in particular, although in these systems there's about 12 different species growing simultaneously, and the idea of a weed is undefined, because everything in the field is useful. There's nothing there that, quote, is out of place. So the big leaf thing that you see over to the left-hand side is a perennial plant that produces edible tubers. You can think of them sort of, are any of you familiar with jicama? Okay, so produces something very similar to jicama, which is this underground tuber, very succulent. It's called yacon. And so imagine there's the corn. Look at the nice, big, broad, flat, thick leaves as opposed to the erect, narrow leaves of the corn plant, which is really good for intercepting sunlight in the upper part of the canopy. And then take a look at what's going down on the surface of the soil. So even underneath the yacon, there's this crop that's called oca. And it also produces tubers which are very similar to potatoes. And these can be turned under, and they're a very rich source of organic matter for the soil. So you're getting the grain out of that, and then these two starchy crops that are really good for staples, valuable for self-provisioning peoples, that then can preserve that for the time of the season. This is in the Andes at altitude, when you're not actually producing crops. So there's an example of the principle of different layers of the canopy, utilizing every layer of the canopy such that any photon that goes all the way to the bottom of the canopy is driving the production of some useful food product. So cute, we may say, exotic, good for other people. And here what I would like to show you is an example of something like this being adapted in the Midwest. So here you see the traditional system of corn production that I just described to you, but you will see this odd thing, which is a strip of prairie in the middle of the monocrop of corn. Now, I will give you an example of why this is an advancement, even though it is a transitional advancement. So here's what this system does. The corn system, as we know today in the Midwest, is tremendously productive of corn grain. It's also tremendously erosion prone. So it fills in public waterways, reduces the utility of navigational channels, reduces the utility of dams, but farmers don't pay that cost. That's all externalized to them. Furthermore, it's also extremely polluting. It reduces the quality of surface water, primarily through nitrates. And with improper utilization of the single largest input of nitrogen to the system, which is the fertilizer element most in demand to stoke productivity, you can also generate nitrous oxide, which, as you know, is 22 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So it is a tremendously damaging crop when pushed for its productivity, and it is in the Midwest. So what this particular system that I will explain to you in just a little bit does is the following. It stops erosion. And stops it. You eliminate erosion with this system. I'll explain why that is in just a little bit. Nitrate runoff, it reduces down to 92%. So in essence, almost all of the nitrate that you would normally lose from this system disappears. Phosphate runoff is closely tied to the amount of soil that you lose from a particular field. And in this case, the amount of phosphate that you lose is reduced by about 88%, 84 to 88%. These are some of the major environmental problems of the system, and the adaptation of that particular modification that I just described to you takes care of it. Well, here's why. The reason is that these strips are not just randomly placed within that field. Those strips are placed by first identifying where water is draining off of that field, and those are the channels where preferentially the soil is being transported from the field, and along with the soil, the nitrates that are in the soluble fraction, the water, and the phosphates that are attached or bound to the soil particles are being lost. So if you find the place in this field where that natural drainage is occurring and place these deeply rooted perennial crops there, you're essentially trapping all of that runoff. And you might say, well, of course, there's the opportunity cost of the corn that is not growing there, so therefore that's going to reduce the income to the farmer. And in fact, it does not reduce the income to the farmer, again, because of the placement of those strips. The placement of those strips is in areas which are actually costing the farmer, because remember, to produce at the level that these farmers are producing, they pay very high prices for GMO seed, very high prices for the inputs to make that seed productive. As soon as you've invested in this high productivity or high potential seed, you have to invest in the inputs that will help you recoup that cost. So you pay a lot for anhydrous ammonia fertilizer, you pay a lot for the machinery to go back and forth and control the weeds, the herbicides, and so on. And so if there are places in the field that because they tend to pond or because they have there are shallow portions of the field because of high erosion, which is exactly what these channels are, then those parts of the field are costing you the seed but not paying you back the cost of producing that corn. So if you find those places and you take the corn out of there and replace it with this, then you're not losing productivity and your net productivity, and you're not losing net profit. Furthermore, you're adding, because remember what this prairie vegetation does. It builds soil. When it breaks down, it adds to the organic matter and to the carbon content of the soil. It helps to retain the soil in place to begin with. It's doing everything that the natural prairie was doing, and furthermore, it adds to the biodiversity here. So the biodiversity is not just the addition of the prairie species, it's the addition of all of the organisms, the insects, the microfauna and microflora that live there. And that has value in terms of pollinators, predator-prey relationships and balance and so on. So there's a very nice paper on this that I can refer you to if you're interested in seeing the benefits of this system. And so this is a system that is being adopted along the fringes of Iowa, which is a state that is, you might imagine, very flat, very productive, but along the edges of the state, it is very erosion prone, and this is a very beneficial system there. So what I'm showing you here, I won't go into an additional study that shows you the viability of very practical alternative systems to the huge monocrops in the Midwest. I simply want to make this point. there is no validity in the concern that if you shift systems to incorporate more biological and ecological knowledge, that it is incompatible with high productivity, high profit, and even producing food. So this is not a threat. Now, we need to expend a lot of time talking about that because we are just accustomed as a culture to believe that if we didn't support that system, we'd run out of food. So let's talk about actually producing food, and let's talk about something that is a greater concern. That system that I described to you does not stand on its own. As productive as the thing is, it actually depends on public support. It is a 100% socialist system. And that's not a metaphor. I mean, literally, we pay our tax dollars to support the system because no matter what goes wrong in that system that I've just described, the monocrop system, whether prices go down, whether there's a natural disaster, a tornado that blows through, a hailstorm that destroys everything that you've paid for in 5 seconds, then you and I, we step in and we make those farmers whole. It doesn't matter what goes wrong. So that is a system that has a positive feedback loop. You're going to do it because if you do that, then you get kept in business by the federal government. So it's not producing food, as we've seen. And let's furthermore take a look at this illustration of what our government actually recommends that we do eat. So you're familiar with this. It's a visual depiction of the USDA guidelines actually developed jointly by the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Agriculture. And it is known as My Plate. If you look at it carefully, you see that it recommends primarily a plant diet. So about 25% of this is what they're referring to euphemistically protein. And there's a lot more to comment on this in terms of how it was derived, but just notice that what the government's recommending that we eat for health purposes is primarily a plant-based diet. And now let's take a look at how we actually invest our resources to support farmers. So what we actually invest is this, as determined by the Office of Congresswoman Shelley Pingree. So notice that corn and other grains and then oils, so that 61% fraction that you see there, and then the, 19% fraction that you see there. So in essence, about 80% of this graph is corn and soy. So that's where we invest the majority of our public dollars to support the agricultural system. Notice that very visible notation up in the right-hand corner there. Less than 1/2 of the total budget of the USDA goes to support fruits and vegetables, which are the thing that the My Plate guidelines say that we ought to be eating preferentially for health. So the government, on the one hand, recommends that we eat one way, and then what they support is completely the opposite. I mean, 180 degrees diametrically the opposite of what we're recommended to eat. Now, there's some interesting historical reasons for this, but let's just follow through with the logical consequences of this. So corn and soy produce the ingredients for the junk food diet. So just a little bit of a side here for those of you that are Trekkies in the audience, you probably know more about this than I do, but you know how that food replicator on the Starship Enterprise works, right? So that food replicator works, you know, you walk up to it, you say what you want, and poof, it appears. Well, so the theory is that down in the hull of the Star Trek Enterprise, by the authors of the series, down in the hull of the Star Trek Enterprise, there's pap. It's just pap that's been formulated by nutritionists to meet all of our daily requirements. But it's shapeless, odorless, flavorless. So when you step up to the food replicator and you said, I want chicken cacciatore, then what it does is it shapes it, moisturizes it, flavors it, colors it, and plops it into the food replicator, and there you are. You don't know the difference. You're eating chicken cacciatore. For all intents and purposes, that's what the corn-soy system is. It's the pap that gets flavorized, colorized, texturized, and then you don't know the difference. You're eating hamburger, you're eating chicken cacciatore. That is the system, and it results in the following. So that junk food system, what fuels the fast food culture that we have, gives us a system where all you have to do is eat 3 times a day when you get hungry. You don't need to go out of your way. You just do what's natural. You get hungry, you eat 3 times a day. What the food system makes preferentially available to you. If you just eat it that way, by the time that you get to middle age, so most of you are too young, by the time you get to middle age, you'll notice there's a little paunch that is developed. And what happens as a consequence of that is about 2/3 of us become overweight by that age. 1/3 of us are obese. We begin to get metabolic diseases such as diabetes, which used to be something that only presented in adults and is now presenting in children. Has increased by 6% since the 1960s. and costs us in terms of healthcare $245 billion. If we just went no further than that, imagine what this means. We're paying billions of dollars to sustain the junk food production system that then goes into the junk food actual delivery system that then we eat, and then it creates metabolic disease that then we have to pay again in order to maintain. We can't live with diabetes for our entire life. It's just a very expensive proposition to do that. That's not it. I mentioned that a third of us have become obese. Again, we become obese in childhood. That cost is $190 billion. By the way, this is a very conservative estimate because there are a lot of costs of obesity that can't be captured just in the direct maintenance of obesity. And then we all die prematurely. The number one killer of Americans is cardiovascular diseases due to the way in which we eat. Actually, 4 of the leading 10 causes of why we die prematurely in the United States, these are chronic diseases, are due to the way that we eat. Actually, as of today, we might actually add a 5th. Many of you may have noticed in today's news feeds that the World Health Organization has pronounced that in their epidemiological studies, so they're not establishing cause, but in their epidemiological studies, they see enough evidence that shows the consumption of processed meats is clearly correlated with the incidence of cancers, particularly cancers of the lower gut. And so this is all related to the way in which we eat. So if all you do is eat when you get hungry, you're going to be participating in this series of diseases that reduce the quality of your life and that cost the public till. Now, some of you may be familiar with the writer Mark Bittman. He has a number of different skills, and this is the one that I value most, and that is that he can listen to you speak for about 45 minutes. He has, I can tell you from experience. And then after you're done, you'll stop and you'll say one sentence. He'll say, "Oh, what you mean is," and delivers it in one sentence. So he's a great synthesizer. So he wrote a column not too long ago where he was surveying basically the facts that I just described, and this was the brilliant way, I believe, in which he described the state of our food system. It's hard to imagine having a food supply as abundant as ours and doing a worse job with it. It's highly productive. Think about the assets, the resources, the public investment that has gone into it, and the result is it makes us sick. So obviously you can see why there's a case to be made for improving this system. Now, who's to decide what would be better? So I will give you an example here through our infographic from UCS. It's called Plant to Plate. I mentioned that, so if you want to have this for yourself, you go to our website and just search for Plant to Plate. As the name indicates, so who are we, sort of like echoing the Pope, who are we to say what you should eat? But scientists, nutritionists, doctors who study what the best food supply is for your health actually do this every 5 years. That's how those dietary guidelines are actually derived. So you've seen My Plate, the recommendations that they come up with. So what we did was to say, what would happen to the structure of agriculture if we actually did not do what the USDA currently does? What if we actually planted what the USDA says that we should eat? And so here are some of the consequences. So first of all, here's a very interesting thing to be aware of. We utilize very small proportion of our land for the production of fruits and vegetables. So fruits and vegetables have a very small footprint, and actually that's the good news here. So rather than to worry about how we're going to, quote, feed the 9 billion, whenever you hear that, think that people are actually trying to fool the 9 billion, because the healthy food supply has a vastly smaller footprint than this sickening food supply that I just described. And one illustration is here. So the illustration, if you look at the numbers closely down the bottom right-hand side there, tells us that currently we plant about 10 million acres of fruits and vegetables, as against 152 million acres of corn and soy. Okay? So about 10 million acres of fruits and vegetables. Now, we could produce much more of our domestic supply of fruits and vegetables. Right now, we import about 60% of our fruit and vegetable supply. We don't produce enough of it domestically, but we could produce a whole lot more. So, if we did increase the domestically producible fruits and vegetables to meet the My Plate requirements, that's the analysis that we did, we would need to produce then an additional 14 million acres, for a total of 24 million acres if you put together what we currently plant and what we need to plant. And that's such a small proportion of the total arable acres in the United States. We could do this. But there's obstacles in the way of farmers actually doing this. In the Midwest, Up until very recently, if you took some of your land out of corn and soy to plant fruits and vegetables, what would happen is that you would lose what is referred to as your corn and soy base. You would be eligible for less government support. If you're eligible for less government support, banks don't lend to you. If you don't have a bank loan, you can't get crop insurance for your crop. You can see what federal policy is doing in terms of determining what we're going to grow and how we're going to grow it. Although, I suppose a bureaucrat or congressman could look at you straight in the face and say that's not what they intended. Nonetheless, it's what the outcome is down at the ground in terms of decisions that farmers have to make. But furthermore, take a look at this. So if we were to increase food and vegetable production to meet the My Plate requirements in terms of what we can do domestically, and we do this to supply local and regional economies, we had our ag economists and our senior economists take a look at this. This is the analysis that I'm describing to you. They did the typical economic balance sheet where you take into account winners and losers. If you're producing less corn and fattening less beef, there's going to be losers there. Then those people are not going to have those markets. But on balance, when you factor in that you're going to be producing more fruits and vegetables and you'll need to have farmers markets to sell those and you'll need to process those fruits and vegetables, you see that the outcome is that you would have in the net 189,000 more jobs than we have right now. And look at the astounding figure in terms of economic development. $9.5 billion more sales due to just producing domestically the fruits and vegetables that we need to meet the USDA's requirement for what we should be eating. Now, this doesn't come free, so we do need to support the farmers with knowledge, with infrastructure, particularly at farmers markets. And so our economists did that analysis as well. So the big orange bubble that you see there is what the nominal corn and soybean subsidies are. But what I mean by that is what we budget each year through a process that's called the Farm Bill to support that large corn soy system. In the budget, it's $5 billion. You should not believe it. It is never $5 billion. This year, it's a little bit over $11 billion that we're actually paying. The system is a gold-plated system, so when prices go down, as they have this year, we step in and make up the difference that the market is not meeting. So, but let's go with this. $5 billion as against what our economists calculated that we would need to invest in order to support fruit and vegetable producers to process and distribute and to give them the knowledge through extension systems and so on. They calculated we would have to invest $90 million, M, as opposed to the $5 billion nominal dollars that we put into the corn soy system. That makes us sick. So you can see why it is that it's really important to shift this system. Actually, the actual question is, why is the system in place to begin with if it has these features that we're describing here? Let me try to run through this very quickly and actually say that one of the reasons is that we just don't care. We're not aware of it. All we do is eat. You know I'm speaking in the generality, but you are in this room because you do care. But the majority of us just eat. And the questions that we ask when we get hungry are, well, you know, what am I in the mood for? What restaurant am I going to? How much time do I have? That's how you calculate where you're going to eat. The other thing that you might calculate is, well, you know, if I'm going to the grocery store, you know, what may I want to eat at home? So how many days will I be having breakfast at home, for instance? And then we buy the components of a meal that can be assembled in 5 to 20 minutes at home, because that's about as much time as we'll invest in putting together a meal on average. So we go to one of these two places to eat, and all we're thinking is about our convenience. In fact, this is one of the major disconnects. So a system cannot provide accurate feedback when the indicator for the shift is not the thing that we're monitoring. The thing that we're monitoring is that it saves us time. It gives us convenience. That's what the food system does. So everything else that I've described is not anything that the rest of us are registering. We're just clearly not aware of everything else that is happening. Now, one of the benefits of this system is what I've just described. It's about as good as the Star Trek replicator. We don't quite have the Star Trek replicator yet, and you should know it's on its way. You know, so with 3D printing technologies, there's people that are working on developing the Star Trek replicator. But it's as good as that system because in essence what it does is it allows you to stand or sit where you are and essentially exert massive global economic power. Because whatever it is that pops into your mind that you want right now, whether it's in season, you know, whether it's native to this place or not, you can have within about 5 to 10 minutes, even in Hanover, whatever it is that you wish for, you can have within 5 or 10 minutes. You realize that's tremendous political and economic power Because that means that at any given moment, this stuff is flowing to you from wherever it actually is in season on the planet. It's being produced, and it's converging on you just in case you may want it. Which is why a massive amount of waste is actually built into the system. And you pay for that. It's not free to you. You pay for the wasted food that is implicit in this kind of a model. Now, so that's why we think it's actually a net benefit. Most of us think of the food system as a marvelous thing because it confers all of these benefits to those of us that are wealthy and can actually exert this kind of massive political and economic power. So for instance, I mentioned the supermarket store. You can walk into one of these places. Not everyone gets one of these places. You need to have about 10,000 people with the median family income in the United States, about $50,000. You need about 10,000 people because it's a return business model. About 10,000 people like that in order to get one of these. But if you have one of these, if you have that kind of pool to support the recurrent business model, you get one of these. You walk into one of them, they may have between 50 and 60,000 items in stock that are in constant churn that you go in there and select from. Now, again, tremendous convenience because these things are mostly ready for you to just assemble in some way or another. Here's the major drivers of the food system that we all participate in. So the major driver is, of the five, I guess I shouldn't say that any are major, but here are really important drivers. So one of these is the convenience that I described to you, that you can just whip through aisle 5 and aisle 10, you know, and maybe go along the periphery and pick up your milk and so on. Most of us develop our routine really quickly. And so that is the convenience factor that I described. We've done away with seasons, so we're accustomed to the fact that no matter what we want, again, whether it's in season or not, we can have it. So that's another major driver. Long shelf life, you know, it's a great interest to the food producers. Once they produce something, they don't want it to be perishable. And this is a really nice example because, you know, one characteristic of this processed food item is that it never spoils. It does not spoil. So it's great in terms of shelf life, and it's really convenient to us because you just, you know, open up the seam and you're gobbling it, and there's no better example of convenience than that. This is also convenient because if you actually want, there's tilapia fillets, I see. If you actually want meat like this in a frozen form, you can essentially get a meal that you just nuke. And again, there it is. And another major driver is that you are not aware of this. I'm positive you're not aware of it. But in the cases where you're actually deciding to go to the grocery store and come back with a few items to assemble into a meal, most of that is actually put into your head. You think it's you, and you think you have choice. But in terms of the incentives that you receive, you know, through, you know, these days it could be through your Facebook, it could be through any number of coupons that come to you online, and also where you envision that you are socioeconomically, there's all kinds of cues that the food industry has become expert in terms of pushing your buttons and delivering the kind of food system that you believe that you deserve. And so this is the kind of system that we have that was blasted away any connection between how the food is produced and the thing that we perceive that we're benefiting from, which is just time savings and convenience. That's our judgment for the quality of the food system. So here's an example of market failure. Everything that I described is a market failure. And it may seem really odd because it may seem like I've just described tremendous economic success. The global food system is a marvelous logistic system to deliver whatever it is that we may want with any prior notice. You know, you can just imagine whatever you want and you can have it. And so that seems like a tremendous success story. But the market breakdown is, you know, in the classical theory of the market is that you have rational agents out there competing against each other, and that raw self-interest essentially creates this self-regulating system where the people providing you goods and services and the people consuming the goods and services all ultimately get the best out of the system. You find the right balance. That's the theory. I've just described to you a system where the more these people can sell you, the sicker we all get. And there's all kinds of reasons. This is not the talk to get into that. There's all kinds of reasons why this occurs, but here's the summary of the majority of them, and that is that there is nothing in what I've described to you that is anything like a free market. It is the single most distorted system that there is in terms of market economics. It's not free, almost entirely engineered. And the original cause that rippled down through the decades to give us the system was that we were interested in keeping farmers on the land as a nation at a time when the majority of us were rural citizens and the majority of us were farmers. So our policies were designed to keep you on the land no matter what. So here we are now where the majority of us do not farm. As a matter of fact, even though you hear this figure of about 2.3 million farmers out there, About 300,000 of them are responsible for the food supply. A very small number of people are taking care of the food supply, and those are the people that we're keeping in business. These are large corporate farmers. They're the single most capable business in agriculture to sustain themselves in a natural market, and they're the people whom we're subsidizing. Now, let me take a look. So let's talk about an aspect of one of the products that you see Lady Liberty holding up here, and I'm just going to focus on it very quickly to talk about the point that I made about things being done in our name in the food system that none of us would condone if we were aware of them and if we had a chance to say something about them. So I'm just going to focus on one little ingredient on this very long list of all these added ingredients in the food system, and that's the hydrogenated palm kernel oil. So these days that palm is actually being grown in huge plantations in tropical parts of the world. If you want to imagine someplace, Indonesia would be one of the places where we have some of the largest plantations. But initially, when European colonists discovered this palm oil, which they were using for industrial purposes initially, it was being harvested from naturally occurring stands in the tropical latitudes, and first out of West Africa. So I want to talk to you about that just very briefly. And it may seem like all of a sudden if you fell asleep and you woke up, you're in a totally different lecture. So just sort of bear with me here. So where colonists, primarily English colonists, began to exploit naturally occurring stands of palm oil was in the Niger River basin here. So to help you visualize it, this is the drainage of the Niger River basin, which then eventually dumps out into the Gulf of Guinea. So in the Gulf of Guinea, I want to read to you about the experience of a certain people referred to as the brass. Now, I'm going to read to you a statement written by the chiefs of the brass to Whitehall. In essence, the foreign department of the British monarchy. And note this year, 1877. Remember that year. It'll be critical for something I want to come back to. So it's really important for people in the context that I'm just about to describe to you to speak for themselves and not for us to interpret what they're trying to say. So I won't give you anything but what the king of the brass is describing here. And so I'll read through this. I'll try to be measured so that the full import of this comes through. So let me expand this so I can read this. We, the undersigned kings and chiefs of brass, west coast of Africa, beg and pray that you will take our case into consideration. Many years ago, we used to make our living by selling slaves to Europeans, which was stopped by your government, and a treaty made between you and our country that we discontinued doing so, and that we should enter into legitimate trade, and that if we did so, an allowance should be paid to us by the traders on all produce bought. This we did, and our trade gradually increased. We shipped about 4,500 to 5,000 tons of palm oil per annum. To do all this, we had to open up places on the Niger, trading stations or markets, as we call them, up as far as a place called Onitsha on the Niger. Some years ago, the white men began trading on the Niger with the intention of opening up this river. This did us no harm, as they went up a long way farther than we could go in their steamers, and also bought a different kind of produce to what we were buying. But lately, within the last 6 years, they have begun putting trading stations at our places, and consequently, they have stopped our trade completely, as well as those in the lower part of the river Niger. And formerly, when we sent nearly 5,000 tons of palm oil away, we do not now send but 1,500 per annum. This means starvation to my people, as well as natives of the Niger under my rule. I have about 8,000 people, and there are another 8,000 in the lower part of the Niger suffering with me. It is very hard, this, on us. Now, here a little bit of interlude before I give you the conclusion to this letter. So at the delta is where the brass lived. And what they're describing, what this king is describing to you, is a system where they were essentially middlemen to British buyers, but where the British eventually began to take over their role as middlemen against the treaty that they had signed with the brass people. So at the delta, these folks had been planting plantains and yams and so on and lived from that, but they were persuaded by the English that they should turn the delta into ports for the concentration and exportation of palm oil. So they gave up self-provisioning to become traders. So that's the context of this. So you just heard what happened from the mouths of the leader of the people. This is the conclusion. We have no land where we can grow plantains or yams. And if we cannot trade, we must starve. And we earnestly beg and pray that you will take our case into consideration. We do not want anything that is not fair. We only want the markets that we and our money have made to be secure to us, and that the white men who have had nothing to do with opening up the palm oil trade shall not come and reap all of our benefits. So I can't think of a more reasonable request than that, to follow a treaty obligation laid out in a very logical term, which these kings sent up. And notice that they knew exactly what was happening to them. So if they could not self-provision, the economic theory of factors of production, well, I'll go over it in just a little bit. So, land, labor, rent. So if you don't actually have self-provisioning and you don't have trade, you will go hungry. You will have no way to earn. And so the brass knew that this was happening. So they sent this letter off to Whitehall, and they never got any response from Whitehall, and the brass perished, which is why you've never heard of the brass. Now, the reason why I give you this story, palm oil, the English could get from any place. And right now, all of us get this primarily through plantations supported by Unilever and other industries like that out of Indonesia. The habitat of such creatures as the orangutan are threatened because of those plantations for palm oil. And we may think of this as an isolated case. I can tell you that on the way to creating the food system that we have today, there have been hundreds of cases like this. Now, I asked you to remember the date, 1877. Now, to this day, in the area that I described to you, so the delta of the Niger River, you have pretty much still the same colonial dynamic taking place, where, to be really blunt about it, the resources are being appropriated for the benefit of people at a distance without regard for what it does to the natives of the area in lots of different ways. And actually what it does do is diminish their quality of life and their ability to sustain livelihood. And you realize that what that actually means is that our food footprint is exceeding our actual political boundaries. So the United States, European powers went through this some decades ago. And these days, it is a country like China, which is actually exerting its footprint into Central Africa, Southern Sudan, Central Tanzania, into the Andean region, and into the Amazon in order to sustain their fraction of the human population. And so these are referred to as modern-day land grabs. Now, the reason why I asked you to remember 1877 is so that we can remember how we got our food system and our own land grabs that are responsible for the modern food system. And so what I want to show you is how in the United States there is poverty, and therefore there is hunger. So because in the modern economy, if you don't have a way to produce for yourself, and if you don't have a way to earn, then you will be hungry, and therefore poverty and hunger go together. In the United States, one of the wealthiest countries of the world, the next time you hear somebody babbling on about feeding the 9 billion, just stop that person, particularly if they're an American, and say, before we talk about feeding the 9 billion, how about feeding the 50 million of hungry people that exist in this country? Until we show that we figured out how to do that, there's no rational argument to say that we have any motivation to teach anybody else to, quote, feed the 9 billion. So, given that, there's great inequity in the United States that breaks down along color lines in the food system. And you can, I'm sure, fast forward ahead and see why that is. So here's the demographic distribution of the ethnic groups in the United States. And here is the poverty rate. And you see that there's a tremendous inequity that cannot be explained by demographics, but it can be explained by our own economic theories. Around that period of time that I've just described to you, we were actually consummating the Great American Land Grab, which began formally in 1830. Now it dates back to the 1600s, but the formal land grab began with the very helpfully named Indian Removal Act of 1830, transparently named. So there's no humor in it, but today's Congress would name something like that the Native American New Opportunities and Jobs Act, because everything used to have jobs in it. But at that time, they were just very transparent about what they were doing. The removal began down the southeast corner of the nation and progressed out westward. It lasted 50 years, a systematic campaign of over 200 different battles, appropriating the land of Native Americans. And we have clearly documented histories of the way that we proceeded, actually ending with the Apache Wars down in the southwest, and if you count Wounded Knee, the massacre there into 1890s. Systematic genocide and extermination and appropriation, that was our own land grab, and it is not incidental that what was appropriated there was some of the breadbasket, what we call today the breadbasket. So that inequity that breaks down by color lines turns out to be not an accidental thing if you remember that we're not looking just at a cross-section in the present. Remember that economic theory, if you expect to find people making a gainful living, it's because they have access to factors of production. Land, labor, rent, and therefore they can express entrepreneurship. If we don't have access to at least one of those, we will be poor. The model will predict we will be poor. So because livelihood for Native Americans was the land, when you deprived them of their land, you made them poor. If you want to find some of the poorest and miserated people on the planet, not just in the United States, on the planet, go to these concentration camps that we refer to as reservations in the United States, particularly in the middle of the country, formerly Sioux land, or down in the Navajo Nation. And you will find these people, and it is no mystery wired that way. Now, let me talk to you about the other example that also helps to explain that chart that we looked at. And that example is the example of enslaving folks. Now, you heard the brass people say that they were also middlemen for trading slaves from the interior of Africa. So what we did was to create the market so that people were essentially abducted from their native places, families were torn apart, were transported across the ocean, they were brutalized, enslaved, systematically for 350 years, and then even after emancipation, systematically excluded from benefit and the benefits of the wealth that their labor helped to create. Because it was that agricultural labor that built up the plantation economy that led to the Industrial Revolution in the United States. And you realize that this is not history that I'm talking about, that if you know how to read today's headlines, that systematic exclusion along color lines is very much alive. So that graph that I showed you is actually a graph that could be titled this way: Roadkill on the way to creating today's food system. I remember I said one of my first lines in describing the food system and why it needs reform. There are things being done to this day in our name in the food system that none of us would condone. If that sounds like history, none of us would be able to enjoy fruits and vegetables or drink milk if it weren't for the systematic exploitation of labor to this day. Particularly in states like New Hampshire, Vermont, this is actually the way in which those industries are actually viable. So let me tell you about these folks. They know exactly what's happening to them. These are members of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They say they work under the slave model, and they're not. This is not an exaggeration, and it's not a metaphor. What these folks know is happening to them is the following. By the way, Immokalee, Florida is a place where there's been actual slavery, people bound in chains and prevented from leaving agricultural labor. But let's just set that aside. Here's what these folks live with. So contrary to what all the rest of us would expect, they have no guarantees to protect their occupational safety. So whereas the majority of us, would be singing to high heaven if we so much got repetitive stress syndromes at our keyboards, these folks can be sprayed with toxic herbicides and they are not covered by law. There's an exemption in OSHA regulations to allow them to be sprayed by pesticides. There's another exemption that allows children of farm workers to work in the fields as young as 12 years old when everybody else should be in school at that age. The fact that it's an exemption shows you clearly what is going on here. These are laborers that work some of the longest work days that there are. They not only have bad jobs, they have the worst jobs in the United States, as shown by the fact that we won't do those jobs. Surveys show there's no wage that we can be paid to do this job. And so here's what they endure. There's no such thing as overtime pay. There is no such thing as workman's compensation if you get injured on the job. It's laughable to even propose that they should have a right to things such as retirement benefits or medical benefits. It's laughable. And then just pause and think what that means. The reason that's laughable is we don't think that they have equal status to us. So therefore we condone this. There are specific laws There's a guest worker program that says that unless you come and do specifically what you are hired to do on your particular dairy, then you're illegally in the country. You must leave. These are folks, now let me just frame this in a slightly different way. In the marvelous modern capitalist world, capital can flow any part of the world that it wants. Through trade agreements, products can be traded anywhere in the world where there is demand. We've created the rules that allow that to happen. But when labor seeks to move, where the demand for labor is, all of a sudden there are political boundaries. Now think of what the outcome of that is. That means that when these folks have come here because the labor demand is here, but they haven't come with papers, they're extremely vulnerable because they don't have legal status. That sets them up for exploitation, which is exactly what we do for them. I'm not saying that any of us do this consciously, but every time you eat an apple, it is de facto what you are doing. So these sorts of things can be hidden because of the fact that if you think about it, so it's Homeland Security, it's the Department of Labor, it's the Department of Agriculture, it's Health and Human Services, it's the Department of Interior. There's a whole slew of agencies that each have their own little regulations looking at their own little thing, and what we need is to set up a policy that says, let's be coherent about the policy goals, the objectives that we want, and here is the place where there is a lock. This is where a lot of these regulations are actually conceived and approved. Now let me quote to you, not what I think, but what Thomas Jefferson thought about this body that he was so instrumental in establishing. I hope you shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our mighty corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial by strength, and bid defiance to the laws of our country. Now, in the very early stages of the establishment of the nation, what the founders thought that they were doing was actually breaking from the aristocratic model that established structural inequality that they had seen in Europe, and they were establishing something new here. You have to wonder what these folks would think if they saw the outcomes at the present day more than 200 years later. But in essence, we've replicated the same sort of thing. Many of you may be familiar with the Princeton Study. I'll give you a citation if you're interested in it, that essentially looked at 18 years, almost 20 years of legislation passed in Congress, where they classified the interest to be served by each of those laws, all the way from regular folks to what they refer to as the economic elite. And they found that over 90% of the laws that Congress passes benefit the economic elite, which tells you that that's not a representative body, regardless of what we must say. So that's what we might say. That's the obstacle we need to overcome in order to be able to reform the food system. And so you might at this point just throw up your arms and say, there's nothing we can do, the system is far too entrenched. So let me suggest to you some things that we might do, and in fact some things that we're trying to do at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So if you knew nothing about this, say if you landed from Mars and I greeted you and I said hello, and I had you look at the situation that we just described, and I said, what is this nation's food policy? You wouldn't blame this Martian for saying, well, it must be exploit people and nature for agribusiness profit. Because every law that we have that affects the system essentially greases that process. Now, there is no law that actually says that, but it's the incoherence of the entire set of laws that allows for this to happen. So we're proposing that we have a national food policy for these goals. We want food, we want health, and we want well-being, which means nobody is exploited along the way in the food value chain. So there's a goal, and therefore our policies need to align with that, which is what we're proposing with this national food policy. Now, specifically, we are saying we can't overcome the lock that exists in Congress. In any given year, and particularly in a farm bill year, the agribusiness sector of this nation can invest northwards of $100 million, which we're not going to come up with to lobby and to influence Congress. But if you take a look at what has happened in other areas where the nation actually has overcome corporate interests, so this one is a really probably the one that we all go to, but you take a look at women's suffrage, you take a look at civil rights. These were movements that took about 100 years of work until eventually the water boiled. And it was essentially the culture of the nation determining that we no longer were going to be putting up with, in essence, devaluing the worth of half of the population. Or we're no longer going to be putting up with eliminating the civil rights of citizens of this nation. And so if you put together the interests of farmers who want to farm sustainably, If you ask laborers what would be fair in return for their labor, if you ask people in the food chain who work for tip wage often, if you ask people in schools what they would like to be able to give children rather than what present programs obligate them to offer children. In short, if you go throughout the entire food chain, particularly the health system where they have to expend those billions of dollars that I documented to you earlier, and they could tell you, we would like to prevent this, there's no reason why we should be dealing with obesity, diabetes, hypertension, cardiac arrest, and so on. I am betting that you will be able to put together a coalition of people that if they're incensed enough about the things that are being done in our name without our condoning it, would actually unite to create pressure, not only on the businesses, because that is one very important lever to push, but on the envelope of policies that determines what farmers and everybody else along this chain think is actually viable and politically feasible for them to adopt. So we don't think that you can get things done by Congress. We think that we actually need executive leadership, and actually that's the only way that if you look at the last couple of years, anything has been accomplished. It's actually has been executive leadership. And I'm not referring to this particular president, particular individual. He is our current president. But what we have done is to initiate a campaign that we're calling Plate of the Union. So you've seen the plate in several different examples throughout this. This Plate of the Union, what we're hoping to do is to force candidates to realize that just like now, they need to show up prepared at town hall debates and the formal debates on television and any place that they're going to encounter voters, they need to be prepared to answer questions around the nation's military, the nation's security, the nation's deficit, about global warming. They all know that they need to be prepared to talk about those things, and we want to make it so they also know they need to answer questions about food. So where do you stand on the use of exploited labor in our food system? Where do you stand on confinement animal-fed operations? Where do you stand on the non-medicinal use of antibiotics in order to sustain that system? Where do you stand on the externalized cost of polluting water as a result of supporting the corn-soy system in the Midwest? Where do you stand on the junk food economy that makes us all sick? So we're hopeful, I vastly exceeded my time here, but we're hopeful that a systematic campaign to insert this into the discourse around the presidential campaign will elevate the topic so that we can get it on a different plane. It isn't just foodies in rooms like this that are talking about the topic, but is well-informed people that realize there is a policy platform that actually determines many things about our food system that none of us would want, and yet the kind of system that we all want is out there available to all of us. I've seen some nice examples here at Dartmouth. I've heard about a lot of work that is going on here that I've said to the students that described it to me as the research and development, the R&D that we need to create the future, more sustainable, more just system of the future. Because if public resources are going to be invested, that's what public resources ought to be invested in. And the system that I've described to you, if they're such strong believers in the market, are free to continue to operate in the market. But if they expect public support, then this is the kind of food system that we all ought to demand that they support or participate in. And the way to do that is to demand that of the candidates that are running for office. So that's the bet that we're placing at UCS. There's a long story to get there, but I don't think it would have been understandable without actually running through some of that. So thanks for your patience.
Thank you. We still have time for questions, so show of hands, and I'll moderate a little bit. Since we are here at Dartmouth, we'd like to give our students the first chance to ask questions. So raise your hands, and I'll identify the students first, and then we'll let other people ask questions. Go ahead, Kathy.
So you talked about the CAFOs, all the the monocropped corn, and all these other problems that are sort of kind of boiled down to animal agriculture. I was just wondering, in the future, in the coming years, how do you plan on implementing policy that will sort of reform this system that's built on the backs of fossil fuels and like land degradation, pollution, and I mean, are people going to need to eat less meat, and we need to reform the systems that produce it? Like, what's what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you've named it. That's what needs to occur. So what we produce and how we produce it are things that need to change simultaneously. So I'll just say very briefly that, that I mentioned earlier that well, it wasn't in this group now that I think about it. So in an earlier conversation, I pointed out that we actually know way more than our policies reflect in terms of better ways of producing our food. So now a reason to consume less meat without getting ideological about it is that it is better for our health. And so, physicians will take care of that recommendation. It's not an ideological recommendation. However, because of the resources that it takes to produce meat and all of the environmental damage that it does, aside from the health damage that it does, there's also a case for better ways of producing meat in integration with the production of crop plants and better utilization of native grasslands and rangelands. So there's an approach there that I'll just refer to as agroecological, because it is the combination of ecological knowledge with an agricultural objective that we know much more about than our agricultural practices reflect, but we're not supporting through policy or through research. We actually developed the system that we have right now because over 150 years we invested in creating the knowledge and the infrastructure that trains farmers and the businesses that support farmers to do what we're doing right now. And that's what we need to recreate for the sustainable system.
Other questions? Oliver.
All right, so you talked about how our regulations have incentivized away from switching from corn, soy to fruits and vegetables, but you also talked about how there was some change. Can you talk about a little bit more about whether there's a shift in that? Because I thought you talked a little bit about that, but I want to hear a little bit more.
Yeah, so here's what's happened. This is in the Farm Bill of 2014. So because of this kind of critique from groups like ours and the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, Food and Water Watch, advocacy organizations like this, there has been a shift. And also I should say, I'm probably giving too much credit to the advocacy organizations. The system that I just described was tearing apart the Republican Party. Because within that single party, there was a portion of their broad coalition that said, we actually do need smaller government, which means that we cannot support subsidies on principle, and they were against the system. But the voting base of those folks are actually the cotton producers that depend on subsidies and the corn producers that depend on the subsidies and so on. So there was an internal rift that made it so that this system was essentially unpalatable and increasingly untenable. It was undefensible, and even at the level of World Trade Organizations, these are practices, World Trade Organization agreements, these are practices that are indefensible. So what has happened is now we've disguised these things. Now rather than making them direct payments and countercyclical payments to deal with the ups and downs in the markets, we call these insurance programs. There's two different forms of insurance programs that have been written into the Farm Bill. And in order to buy out the opposition, which is essentially folks clamoring for fruit and vegetable production, and now farmers who support, who want to grow fruit and vegetables can actually apply to the USDA to get loans and to get credit. But here's the issue. It's still an obstacle because when you go, let me just give you the example of insurance. So unless you've gotten insurance, you can't get a loan. So when you go to get insurance and you're a fruit or let's start with corn, you're a corn soy producer, the conversation is short. If you filled out your form online, there is no conversation. You just get automatically approved. If you're fruit and vegetable production in an area where there hasn't been significant vegetable production, and particularly if you're producing something that the adjusters in that area know nothing about, and in the whole Midwest, they know nothing about anything that's not corn and soy. So if you go and say, I'm going to do tomatoes, they have no actuarial tables to say, so the risk is X, therefore the cost of my policy is going to be Y. And so that was a barrier for the longest period of time, and they're still sorting that out. The current agreement is that what they'll do is that they'll tag the cost of insurance to the actual wholesale value of the product that is to be insured. So little by little, these new practices are being implemented, and there's now what is referred to as planting flexibility. So if you decide to take a small corner of your farm and plant fruits and vegetables, then you don't lose your corn and soy base, which was a huge obstacle previously. So there are some things like this that are beginning to shift, but they're way out on the margins Because if you want to do something that will make you a laughingstock in your community in the Midwest, is to say, you know what, I'm not doing corn and soy, I'm going to do plums. And it's not only the knowledge that you need and so on, it's just that you will be really odd. You need to really go against the current. So some of these things are deep policy issues, some of these are cultural issues, and they're not comparable, those two things, but they're both real and you need to deal with them. So that's what I was referring to, Oliver.
Other questions? You had a question, right?
Me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, wait for the microphone.
Oh, sorry. I heard something several years ago about the native people in the Sioux region in the Midwest growing hemp. And the federal government said growing hemp, which was for, that product was used for fiber, and they had already pre-sold it to France and so on, and the federal government went in and destroyed it because it related to pot. And is that still going on? Because hemp is a product that doesn't need a lot of water and cultivation and so on, and it's a crop that would permit people to have profit on land that's not very productive.
Yeah. So I don't know that particular case. I can't speak to that particular case, but it is a problem for many farmers that are interested in actually getting back into the industrial hemp production. There was legal industrial hemp production all the way through the Second World War. Then it was made illegal, and now there's a lot of clamoring for it to return. There's lots of economic and also agronomic reasons to be able to plant a crop like that. Conventional farmers in Kentucky would like to use it as a replacement, say, for the tobacco crop. Because, at very small scale, like in the small farm plots that they have, it makes a lot of sense in terms of its climate adaptation and so on. So there's a growing clamor for that, and it's possible that because in certain pockets of the country there's less fear of growing the actual drug marijuana, then there is less reason not to want to plant its relative for industrial purposes. So that probably will begin to shift.
Any other questions? Casey, go ahead. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Okay.
There's a student question here, and then we'll do Casey. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Hello, my name is Reagan. First, I just want to say thank you for a really compelling presentation. I am a graduate of a fledgling sustainable ag program at a land-grant institution, and kind of going along with some of your answers to the other questions, it really seems like technology, capital, business follow research money. And I'm curious, kind of based on your experience in Iowa and wherever else, what your thoughts are on the allocation of research monies to more non-conventional agricultural research and some of the challenges and perhaps prospects in that.
Yeah, great question. So there's no doubt that the culture of the land grants needs to shift, because that's actually where we create the worldview about what agriculture can be, and then that's propagated because the people who leave there go to become the farmers, or they go to become the input salespeople. Actually, the majority of them do that, and they also go to populate the industry that develop the products for that input sector. So it's a little bubble that's self-sustaining there. So there's a couple of things at play here. Because of the time, I'll just let you know that we recently have done some systematic research on this, which actually has been very useful in terms of engaging in a productive way, in a collegial way, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So they manage the program that doles out the public funds that support researchers in agriculture. And the systematic research that we did was to demonstrate to them that what they're spending in agroecological work is a small fraction of their total budget. So it's 2% of the total budget for agroecology. Now, if you're really generous and you say components of agroecology, then it balloons to a whopping 15% of what they're supporting. But when we demonstrated that, at least in this administration, there are people there who are sympathetic. And one outcome of this was that the our agroecologists that did that research was invited to participate in the proposal review panel that actually makes decisions about how much money and whom it goes to. She just got through with that exercise last week, and she's been invited to go to USDA to speak to the National Institute of Food and Agriculture and deliver her research results. And actually, Anne was very helpful to us, along with several other prominent scientists. I mean, not people that you can marginalize and say, that they're granola people, but prominent Foursquare scientists, 4 or 5 of Anne and people of her stature, visited with top-level USDA administrators and showed how a lot of their practices, whether intentionally or not, are actually creating obstacles for people that want to do systems-level research, which is what sustainability is all about. They're receptive. At the same time, we need to be really careful. We can't get as far being adversarial to them as we can being engaged with them. But then when you engage with them, we have to be really aware that, I mean, you saw some of the figures here. What they're devoting to do agroecological work is a pittance, both against the absolute amount that they have available, but more importantly, against the need. Unless we learn to do things in a different way, the future security of the nation's food supply, and therefore of the nation, is at stake. So those are really the important questions. We're working on it, and we have allies.
Okay, I guess I'll take maybe what I'm just realizing that it's 5 to 6 and we're going to do reception before 6 too. But if you're willing to stay and interact, we'll maybe take 1 or 2 more questions now. So there was another student hand, I think, over here. Yeah, Shash, and then the lady in the back, and then that'll be it.
So you said you shed some light on groups of laborers that were being exploited and essentially dehumanized by the current farming system that we have in place. But then also kind of on the other hand, we have the government telling us that we should be eating more fruits and vegetables. So how, I guess morally, how should we be going about eating more of these fruits and vegetables if we know that certain groups of people could be could be put in a worse position because of our actions, and kind of how do you propose, kind of crossing those 2 boundaries, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so one way is to just not go along with the collusion, which is to pretend like that doesn't happen. So you're at step number 1 already. And then the other thing is to actually form a common cause with these groups that are demanded basically just the same rights that the rest of us have in terms of fair wages for the work that they do. That is a difficult ask, a very complicated topic, but some of these groups, particularly I showed you, Gerardo Reyes was the gentleman to the right, who's one of the leaders of the Coalition of the Immokalee Workers. They have been very successful by saying, farmers aren't the problem. There's not a whole lot of money in their business model to be able to pay us more. If we want them to be able to pay us more, we have to follow the food chain, literally the food chain, to where they're paid more, and therefore they can afford to pay us more. And they have done that brilliantly. So that, for instance, they were able to convert, actually, let me back up. They did public campaigns that threatened the single most valuable asset that any food retailer has, and that's their reputation. So they stood outside McDonald's and Wendy's and all these different outlets with signs that said, if you eat here, you're supporting human slavery. So those companies immediately capitulated. McDonald's immediately capitulated. The last thing they could afford was to have people like that. And all these people are asking is for an additional 1 penny per pound of tomatoes that they harvest. So if you actually say to a manager at a place like Wendy's, which is recalcitrant, they're resisting doing that, 1 penny per pound to tomato harvesters, every hamburger has a tomato on it, then that's the sort of thing that will say, I understand what's going on here, and that sort of pressure, it's not the ultimate thing. Policy shift is the ultimate thing, but that sort of thing will work hand in glove with those of us that are working the policy angle to redress those kinds of things, those kinds of injustices. By the way, whether you take anything else out of this or not, there's one line that I find particularly useful, particularly when speaking to the industry magnates leading the companies in the interest that I've just described to you, that really puts the conversation at a different level. And that is, they'll talk about feeding the 9 billion and the most abundant, affordable, secure food supply in the world, all that sort of stuff. And you just use some of the facts that we covered here today to make the conversation real, and just look at the person in the eye and say, look, either you don't understand the way that the food system works, or you think that I don't. So, and one way or the other, you're being cynical if it's the first case, or in the second case, you're ignorant, and you're not entitled to talk about this topic. But you just don't let the conversation proceed being about feeding the 9 billion and all kinds of fantasies around why we have the system that we have in place right now. It's about exploiting people and nature for agribusiness profit, and if they're using our tax dollars to do that, that's wrong. It's that simple.
Okay, the lady in the back, that'll be the last question, and then please join us outside for some lunchies.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm Dee Dee Pursehouse, and I'm part of a nonprofit called the Soil Carbon Coalition, and I just wanted to say I loved your presentation. It was phenomenal. And one exciting piece of news to add to the part you were talking about of restoring prairies. that the prairies evolved, those biodiverse landscapes evolved with grazing animals. And we've been collecting data, monitoring changes in soil carbon, which comes through photosynthesis into the soil. And in some of the prairie systems that we're looking at where they're using cattle to mimic the original impact of bison and buffalo, we're seeing increases in soil carbon to the tune of 300 to 800 Canadian citizens' CO2 emissions are being put back into the ground for each square mile of land that's being managed that way. So there's a whole other level of benefit and a whole other level of risk when we let soils deteriorate. So, thanks.
Excellent point. Thank you.
Okay, let's give Ricardo a great